The video you're about to watch was recorded here at Oak Spring in late 2016 at a meeting focused on crop wild relatives, the wild relatives of our most important crop plants, and the initiative funded by the Norwegian government to collect the genetic diversity of those wild plants and to make that genetic diversity available for breeding into our most important crops as we have to face the problems of climate change and drought and so on. About halfway through the video, we also delve into another topic of the same meeting that was held here, which was really how do we bring together those who are trying to conserve plant diversity with those who are also concerned about using plant diversity. So without any more from me, here's the video and we hope that you enjoy it.
The Crop Trust mandate is quite simply to safeguard the diversity of the major crops for food security. It's a fabulous diversity out there. Although we have lost also a lot of diversity, we still have quite a bit of diversity out in the field, thank goodness. But we have even more in the plant gene banks of the world. So the Crop Trust, we mainly work on ex situ conservation in plant gene banks. If we go to the US, for example, you have lost almost 90% of your fruit and vegetable varieties if we only look back to 1900. So thank goodness we haven't lost all of it, because quite a bit of it can be found in the gene banks. You can go to China today. They only use 10% of the rice varieties that they used to use in the 1950s. So these gene banks are fundamentally important. We are also concerned about conservation in the field, but our mandate is related to conservation in gene banks. We have a 10-year project in the Crop Trust where we collect wild relatives of the domesticated plants. These wild relatives are absolutely fascinating.
Over the last 10, 15 years, there's been a dramatic increase in the interest in crop wild relatives as a source of new genes for breeding new varieties, and new varieties that are needed for feeding the world basically in a very changing environment. How do we feed the world when temperatures are 2 degrees higher than they are today? And part of the answer to that comes from the genes that can be found in the wild relatives of crops. And in many cases, these are plants that are growing in desert areas, dry areas, hot areas, and so on, subject to very different stresses than most crops are. And so over time, they will have evolved genes, characteristics for maintaining life and being productive in those environments. So if we can collect them and study them, evaluate them, find out what characteristics they have, then the attempt to move those characteristics, the genes for those characteristics, into domesticated varieties. We might be able to come up with new varieties for the future that will have built-in resistance to high temperatures, able to withstand droughts and so on. So there's been a big collecting effort to try and collect examples of these various wild relative crops and make sure that they're conserved in gene banks for the future. A lot of these wild species themselves are very threatened. Maybe urbanization is destroying the land, or the agricultural land is expanding. And so many of these wild relatives that we're interested in here are actually threatened. If you look at feeding the world in the future, that's got to be important. Possibly one of the most important things that we can be addressing.
But we're really talking about the question of how we're going to feed 9 billion people sustainably in the future. And I think we take it all the way back to crop wild relatives as a source of genetic variation. That is necessary, not sufficient, but it's certainly necessary in order to breed new varieties that we think will be able to be productive as the climate changes and in light of the demands on us. But I think the problem that we're here to discuss is more how different communities understand and accept or even will promote different solutions, and what kind of commonalities we feel we have and where we think there are gaps in understanding. And those are the gaps that need the bridging. So first, I think we're here to kind of come to an understanding of what we have in common, both on the science side, on the policy side, and then what kind of communication is needed to ensure that we enter into some form of dialogue with the public. We heard a lot about conservation, and the question about conservation is sometimes diametrically opposed to the people who want to utilize those resources, and we're trying to bring those two groups together so that conservation and utilization have a common goal. So you conserve in order to utilize, and you utilize in order to sustain life on the planet.
The conservation area itself is very fragmented. There are people who focus very much on conservation of plants in protected areas, other people that focus very much on conservation of crop diversity in gene banks, other people who focus entirely on how to use those resources in crop breeding, and each has stories to tell, and they're compelling and important to tell, but they don't necessarily always connect with each other. And sometimes, indeed, they're even sort of almost competitive with each other, as if, you know, it's a zero-sum game, and that hinders the message in many cases.
I think the other major challenge is how to get this material used. Because of the nature of these plants, if you just make a cross between a wild species and a domesticated variety, the progeny of that cross are often pretty much useless in their own form. You have to cross several times, you have to make very careful selection and so on before you can arrive at something useful. That involves a lot of work and sophisticated laboratories in a lot of cases. This work is targeted mainly at developing countries. Probably the majority of developing countries don't really have the facilities or the training staff or the institutions even to be able to do that very meticulous breeding work. A major part of the project is to try and build the capacity of developing countries to be able to make use of this material that's being conserved. Because unless it's used, the reason for collecting it becomes purely a conservation reason, whereas the donor, the Norwegian government's primary interest is in coming up with new varieties that are going to make farmers more productive in the face of climate change.
And since I'm a professor, I train many students from different parts of the world. What we probably need is a dimension of policy commitment in order to create the opportunity for them to do that work in many different countries around the world. So if we had, out of this conference, if we had a concerted effort and an agenda that said that we want to go in that direction, I think we do have the people in the pool of breeders that are being trained who could start to really make it work and make it give us novelty that would enhance our nutritional opportunities. It would enhance our ability to have new crops that can grow in environments that our old crops can no longer grow in as the climate changes. I think we'd have a lot of interest in it. So exploration of these wild things, it's not just like the people back in the Stone Age did that. It's something we can do today, and with a little bit of imagination, I think we can do something very exciting.